Okay, so the final part then of our little trip through the lymphoid system here, we'll close off with some of these other organs here. The next one to really, I guess, be important for us is the spleen. The spleen is the largest of all of these organs in question, just by mass, but it's also not exclusively a lymphoid organ. You may remember we did talk about it quite a bit, actually, when we talked about the circulatory system, because it does also play a fairly large role in the circulatory system, right? It's there to produce red blood cells very, very early on in development. And then later on, it's there to remove old blood cells and recycle them, right? So we talked about that whole process where we begin breaking them down and recycling the hemoglobin and all that stuff. That stuff begins here in the spleen. So when we talk about the structure of the spleen, there are going to be parts of it that are going to be lymphatic, and there are parts of it that are going to be circulatory, and we need to kind of distinguish between those two things. Because it has such an outsized role in terms of dealing with blood, it is served by a very, very large artery here, the splenic artery. I'll show you a picture here. I don't know if you can get context from this. This vein, our artery here, is about the size of my pinky finger. It's big. It is a very, very big artery because the spleen requires a very, very large internal flow of that blood. The splenic artery, splenic vein come into the spleen at a structure called the hilum, okay? And we're going to see this term hilum again and again and again. We actually should have seen it in the last video. I forgot to talk about it. A hilum is just any place on an organ where we have a lot of things coming into or leaving it, right? So the hilum here of the lymph node is where we've got a bunch of these vessels all closely packed together. They both happen to be efferent vessels at this point, but that doesn't really matter. Here at the spleen, right, you can't see where it's coming in here, but where the splenic artery, where the splenic vein come into the spleen, they come into a section of it kind of in the same area. That's the hilum there. Talk about the hilum of the lung, where the bronchi or the pulmonary arteries, pulmonary veins enter and leave. Again, it's just part of the nature of an organ is that if there's going to be a bunch of plumbing, they're going to want to have all of that plumbing come in and out of the same spot. And that's really all a hilum is for us. But it's an important thing to kind of be able to recognize. What does the spleen do? Well, it's a place where we can have some lymphocyte proliferation, proliferation. So there are going to be some structures within here. I'll show you the picture that are going to be related to lymphoid and immune function. And there are also going to be parts that are going to be built around circulatory structures, right? Removing those old red blood cells, stuff like that. So obviously, kind of as a rehash here, right, we talked about the recycling, the reusing of hemoglobin, things like iron. Spleen stores a lot of that stuff. It does tend to store platelets. We do see monocytes, whether they're being stored here, whether they just hang out here, you know, not really sure. But we do know that when we open up somebody's spleen, there's a lot of monocytes in there. So there. It's built much like a lymph node was, right? Fibrous capsule, trabeculae, internal chambers, all that kind of good stuff. But in terms of the internal parts, beyond that, we are going to be a little bit different. And the reason we're going to be a little bit different here again is because we are doing both jobs. We are doing both a circulatory system job and an immune system job. And so we're going to subdivide the area in those chambers into white pulp and red pulp. The white pulp is going to be stuff that is lymphatic, okay? So the stuff that's around the arteries that come into and branch off inside of the spleen, this is going to be lymphatic. Or we've got veins, okay? Here's where we're going to have the red pulp. And the red pulp, this is where we're going to do the circulatory stuff. So again, going back to this picture, we take a cross section through our spleen. Here's our capsule, right? Here are our trabeculae coming in, dividing our internal chambers. Surrounding the internal arteries is the white pulp. Surrounding the internal veins is the red pulp. Circulatory, lymphatic, immune. Another organ here that's kind of unusual in terms of how it does what it does is the thymus. And the thymus is really, really important when you're young, but it shrinks, it gets smaller and smaller and smaller as you get older because its importance becomes slightly less as you get older. It sits kind of right on top of the heart. And what it does is, so if our lymph nodes, if our follicles are boarding schools for B cells, our thymus is the boarding school for T cells. Okay, thymus, T cells, follicles, B cells. And so this is really the only place where these T cells become what we're going to call immunocompetent, or basically safe for functioning out in the rest of the body. Now, there's a lot of stuff going on in here. I'm not going to make you worry too much about all this stuff. Frankly, we don't have time. It's not a big deal. But again, I just wanted to show you here that as a lymphoid organ, it has this same basic structure, right? A capsule, we have trabeculae subdividing, we have a cortex, we have a medulla within. Same basic idea, same basic structure to all of this stuff. It lacks follicles. There are no B cells, right? I cannot stress that enough. That's really the biggest, most important part of this whole deal. Thymus is for T cells only. Okay, it is not for B cells. There are no follicles. It is only for T cells. Other bits of lymphoid tissue scattered around the body that are relatively important. In the last video, we talked about the idea that your mucous membranes have a lot of lymphoid tissue in them because they are exposed to the outside world. The lymphoid tissue within these mucosae, okay, we call MALT. Mucosa associated lymphoid tissue, MALT. And again, the reason behind this, right, is that this is where we're going to encounter the most pathogens, right? So lining your nose, your eyes, your ears, your mouth, your urethra, any other external genital tract you might have, okay? These are places where we have your rectum. These are places where we have all of this MALT because these are places where these pathogens are going to try to get in. We're also going to have them internally in structures like tonsils, in your appendix, and in your Peyer's patches, as we discussed last time. Your tonsils, the last really big, most important thing here, your tonsils are really kind of unsung heroes, really. They are extremely simple, right? They're very, very basic. What they do is very, very basic, but they are extremely vital, and they are vital from the moment of birth, unlike a lot of these other structures. So we have all of these tonsils basically kind of surrounding your pharynx, surrounding the conjoined air food passageway at the beginning of your throat. And so we've got some that are on your palate, the palatine tonsils. We have some around the base of your tongue, the lingual tonsils. We have some on the backside of your nasopharynx, the pharyngeal tonsils, tonsil. And we've got a couple of these surrounding the audio tube or the auditory tube or the pharyngotympanic tube, right, the tubal tonsils. And their job, right, is to gather, to collect, and to remove pathogens from the air you breathe and the food that you eat. They have follicles within them. So again, B cells, right, follicles, B cells. But importantly, they differ from all of these other structures because they do not have a capsule. There is no fibrous capsule, there are no trabeculae. What they have instead are little cracks and crevices, okay, between the various parts of them that we call crypts. Okay, and the job of the crypt is to be a place where these bacteria or whatever else can fall down in and get trapped. When they fall down and get trapped, two things happen. Number one, they don't enter the rest of your body, which is great, right? But two, they provide sort of an easy access point for the B cells of the tonsil to run into them, to encounter them, and to be used to dealing with them for later use. So if we look at a little picture here, this is what a tonsil looks like in cross section, right? With all of these little cracks and crevices here. These are our crypts and all of our little follicles lining the entire way. You might imagine that if there was a capsule, it would surround it like this, and that the trabeculae would come down and fill these spaces here where the crypts are. Because that capsule is gone, because the trabeculae are gone, we have these gaps, these holes, these little crypts for us to use to trap bad stuff. Also here, Peyer's patches, all this kind of stuff. Again, same basic idea. We're just trying to have B cells in a place where they're most likely to encounter pathogens. Right? That's really all it comes down to for us. And again, here, a little section through a Peyer's patch showing the same basic structure that we've always seen, right? Medulla, cortex with nodules in it, with follicles in it rather, with a fibrous capsule, trabeculae, all that kind of stuff. Now, developmentally speaking, okay, this stuff starts early on. Okay, so the lymphatic vessels themselves start by about week 5, so the beginning of the first month, right? And they start around the same time that the circulatory system starts, because again, we think about the original function of this stuff, it was to return fluid to the circulatory system. So as blood flows through these developing vessels, we need to have a way to get them back. Lymph nodes develop from that. Lymphatic organs, excluding the thymus, are mesodermal in origin. Okay, so they come from the same basic primordial tissue that things like muscles do. The thymus, though, is endodermal. The thymus is actually going to grow out of the back of your throat. Okay. Importantly here, right, your immune system, your lymphoid organs are trash when you are born. You are absolutely garbage, trash, ass at having an immune system. Okay, with one exception, your tonsils and your spleen. Okay, your spleen is there because it's been making red blood cells for you. Your tonsils are there in an immune role. And this is why if you have a baby or you've been around a baby, they are constantly sticking crap in their mouth, right? Part of this drive to do that is to expose their tonsils to as many common pathogens as they possibly can, so they can begin developing an immune system of their own. At this point, all of the antibodies in their body are ones that are left over from mom, from the placenta, and if baby is continuing to breastfeed, it's getting some of those antibodies through the breast milk there as well. But it has none of its own. Okay, baby has no immune system, and it has to start kickstarting it. And so this guy right here, therefore, becomes vital for us very, very early on to begin the process of doing that. Now, as soon as you're born, you begin to try to build this thing up. Because, again, if you don't have one, you will die. So it becomes a relatively important thing for us, but we start at 0. Okay? All right, so in the next video, we will go ahead and move forward from there. We will talk about the immune system itself. So a lot of these players are going to come back in slightly different form. We'll spend a lot of time talking about B cells and T cells, but that's for another video. So I will see you guys then. Have a good day and keep safe.